Today we're going to finally get to one of the most requested design experiments I've been asked about, mixing concrete and epoxy resin. Oh, and we're also making green concrete. For concrete, we're using Quikrete Countertop mix in white. It's a 6,000 psi mix, which means it's quite strong, and it has no large pieces of aggregate in it. For molds, I'm using glass bowls from a thrift store. Normally I wouldn't use glass, but I really want to see what's going on when I mix these two ingredients. The first layer I poured in, I just used plain white concrete, and then I added some of this sage pigment from Limestrong. It's meant for a plaster finish for interior design, but I really like their pigments for coloring concrete. I mixed up the green right after the white, so there was only about 3 to 5 minutes in between the pours, but that's typically enough to create nice separation even when you vibrate and settle the wet mix. I then placed the inner bowl and filled it with water so it'd have a little bit of weight, but even then I still had to put a board and a rock on top of it to hold it down. I let the concrete cure overnight before adding the epoxy. I'm using thickset clear casting epoxy by Total Boat. It's a really easy to use epoxy, and unlike a lot of the other ones, you can pour this thick. It's a 3-to-1 mix ratio, and the only real trick is to make sure you really scrape the sides when you stir it. They even recommend stirring it in one container for 2 to 3 minutes, scraping the sides, and then transferring it to another container, and then mixing again for another 2 minutes before pouring. Tiny air bubbles can get trapped in the epoxy, so if you really want it to be crystal clear, you can use a heat gun or a torch to remove some of those bubbles. Now this epoxy takes its time to set up. That's good because if it sets up too fast, then you couldn't get these nice thick pours. I want the epoxy to be somewhat cured, but not completely hard so that the concrete can interact with it. So I waited about 7 hours before adding the next 2 layers of concrete. I was kind of hoping for a lava lamp type aesthetic, and it definitely achieved that. Now I think if I would have done it a little bit sooner, I probably would have gotten a little bit more of a 3-dimensional interaction, but I also probably would have had some of the concrete poking all the way through and touching the lower level of concrete. The concrete is heavier than the epoxy, so I did have the epoxy come up to the surface in one point, and it created a big air bubble. So I just went back in and added a little bit more concrete to fill that up. I was planning on leaving the inner glass bowl inside, and to remove the outer bowl, I just hit it with a hammer. I rarely use mold release when I'm working with concrete. In my experience, concrete just doesn't stick to plastic or glass. And I didn't have any trouble getting the glass off of the concrete. However, the epoxy really stuck to it. These light taps with the hammer were enough to break the glass and let it fall away without damaging or scratching the concrete. However, when I hit the glass that had epoxy behind it, it acted like bulletproof or tempered glass. It shattered, but it didn't fall away, and the break marks were very contained to the hammer strike. At first, I was a little worried that I was just going to be stuck with this weird jagged layer of glass on it, but then I realized if I just kept tapping it with the hammer, the glass would powderize and just sort of fall away. It took me about 45 minutes to get the glass off. I probably could have done it a little bit faster, but even as it was, I scratched up the surface of the epoxy a little bit. I used a chisel to scrape off the last few little stubborn pieces, and then used my rotary tool to sand out some of the scratches where I got too aggressive with the chisel. I sanded the epoxy down to 220 grit, and then took the whole thing outside so they could clean up the top edge with my angle grinder and a 40 grit flap disc. This is my primary way of shaping and grinding concrete once it's already fully cured. I got to try out my Ryobi cordless detail polisher and sander, and I'm not trying to get this crystal clear, so I just used a basic polishing compound and polished epoxy so it had a surface quality similar to sea glass. I really like how this experiment came out. I definitely need to improve a little bit on the epoxy. I'll go over everything I learned from this experiment after we hear a word from the sponsor for this video, Replica Surfaces. Replica surfaces are rigid, lightweight, stain-resistant photography surfaces that replicate real textures like marble, wood, cement, and more. They are an essential tool for bloggers, photographers, shop owners, and anyone with a story to tell. It's hard to take good photos. Replica Surfaces helps you create a mini studio anywhere so you can instantly produce better and enviable photos. We're in a temporary production facility, and so I really appreciate that they're lightweight, high quality, and easy to transport. They're made here in the US, and the textures are hyper realistic and well designed to have just the right amount of reflectivity but without too much glare. You can mix and match based on what type of product you are shooting and can create more than 150 different combinations by mixing and matching surfaces. Every 4 to 6 weeks there's a limited release that sells out within hours, and if you bundle 2 or more surfaces together, you can receive free stands and free shipping. With replica surfaces, you get more than just a backdrop. They have a ton of great resources available, such as photography how-tos, and a VIP Facebook community with 10,000 plus members who share what they're learning. There's a whole bunch of great content there, from weekly YouTube videos, daily Instagram tips, and some quality TikTok videos. Start building your collection today. Go to replicasurfaces.com and use my code HOMEMADEMODERN to get 15% off your first purchase. All right, back to the project.
All right, so what did we learn from this experiment? Well, we got really clean lines both between the layers of the colored concrete, good adhesion between them, and we also did the same between the epoxy and the fully cured concrete. We also saw that we can get this kind of organic, lava-like type aesthetic by pouring the concrete on top of the partially cured epoxy. Now, I think the interesting question would be, how does the cure time of the epoxy relate to these kind of organic forms that we're getting on this top level? I think it would be interesting to do a series of experiment where you tried, epoxy at 3 hours, epoxy at 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours, and could really start to see those differences. I think you'd want to do those site specific though. There's so many environmental conditions that impact the way epoxy cures, room temperature, humidity, things like that. So I'd be hesitant to publish like a guide where people then feel like, oh, I know exactly how long I have, and then do it. Also, the thickness and just the overall volume and amount of epoxy really impacts that. But I would just suggest that if you're going to do anything of scale where you're using a lot of material, you probably would want to do a series of smaller test pours that were relative to the same proportion, and then kind of get your own sort of working guide to get the shapes and kind of forms that you want. Mold release. I always get people asking me, why don't you spray something on your concrete forms? To be honest, I've never really had much of an issue of concrete sticking to the formwork. Wasn't the issue here, but epoxy is a totally different story. I was so surprised at how firmly it bonded to the glass. It was like bulletproof glass, where you're hitting the glass with a hammer and it's just, the glass is cracking, but it's not falling apart or moving. And I definitely think there'd be probably a good idea to spray some sort of mold release on the inside of the glass before doing the epoxy layer. Now, one of the reasons why I didn't want to try that is I did want the epoxy to adhere to the concrete, and frankly, I guess I was just a little too lazy to make a kind of a blocking layer where I could spray in the mold release so it's just hitting the glass and not hitting the concrete. I think there's also some ways around that. If the concrete was a little more textured and had some interlocking pieces, that would be a way to get that adhesion, but just spraying the mold release all over the place. Now, in terms of the clearness of the epoxy, I actually don't have that much experience working with these kind of two-part epoxies. It is kind of a sea glass level of clarity. If you want to go crystal clear, I would really check out the work of Modustrial Maker and Jonny Builds. Those are two awesome making and DIY YouTube channels, and they have both done a ton of projects with Total Boat epoxy. I think they're actually Total Boat ambassadors. Really good design, really good execution, and quality content. So defer to them to really get your finer tips and tricks for working with epoxy. Now, one of the reasons why I like to do experiments is that you kind of discover things that you weren't really looking for. And so for this project, the glass sticking to the epoxy was really annoying. That was the most time-consuming part of it. But it really got my wheels turning, and I think there's a ton of cool things I can do with the fact that it sticks so well. I could get like cheap old window glass from a thrift store, that isn't tempered or isn't particularly expensive or strong, but then use the epoxy to add both a safety factor, meaning that if it does break, it's not going to send glass shards all over the place. They'll be kind of bonded to that. But more importantly, I think I could get glass pour a really thin layer of epoxy and then actually break the glass and kind of bend it and then pour another layer over it. So it could be kind of this cool kintsugi type project where you're seeing the cracks in the glass, but there's smooth layers of epoxy on both sides. So what was unfortunate for this project could lead to a whole nother set of experiments that it might actually come out great. I also like the idea of being able to kind of structurally reinforce cheap glass. I've cut the tops off of wine bottles or whiskey bottles. Tells you a lot about my lifestyle habits. And that glass tends to be a little bit more brittle than like the kind of tempered glass you'd get for furniture applications. But if I can take a clear glass bottle and coat the inside with a colored epoxy, get this kind of cool two-tone look to it, and also know that it could make it a little bit stronger, and more importantly, make it not as dangerous if it breaks, meaning that it doesn't completely crash down. I mean, could I make a table leg out of glass bottles that I reclaimed that are just kind of epoxied together? I don't know, but it's interesting, right? Like, this is why I just love experimenting. There's so many projects where I kind of have an intended outcome of where I know I want it to go, but the ones where I can get it to where I want it to go and then figure out a whole new set of projects branching out from that initial idea are really the good ones. The other thing that I started thinking was there's an opportunity with the inside of this mold to do something really fun. One, we could kind of tilt it on its side, pour in a layer of a colored epoxy, tilt it, pour in another layer, pour in another layer. And that way when you're seeing through, you're seeing these different colored striations depending on the angle of the bowl when you poured those layers. So I think we could take this simple way of making a mold and really expand upon it. Now, it's always weird when I break glass, like people kind of freak out. Like, look, that was like a $2 thing that I got from a thrift store, but I still get the point. So if you want to be very mindful of waste, you could probably use like a big glass bottle, like one of those big gallon glass, like apple juice jugs or vinegar jugs or something like that. I also use a lot of plastic for my mold making, like a 2-liter soda bottle and stuff like that. And if you look into sort of early videos I did for Homemade Modern, there's a ton of like concrete vases and pendant lamps using that kind of plastic trash. So I didn't use plastic for this one because I thought that the plastic would be the problem sticking to what's basically a plastic epoxy, but it turns out even glass was a problem as well. So thanks for watching. The links to the concrete, the pigments, the epoxy, and the buffing tool that I used are all in the description. Subscribe if you feel like it, and thanks for watching. All right, bye.